So I guess I'll start off because normally,
Sure.
like I kind of know what um, what it is that I have an issue with what it is that lots of people on the left normally say when it comes to this. So um, I obviously believe in systemic racism, and I believe that there are like different types of racism that we can look at. Um, and I think that things like prejudice plus power equals racism. Like, this is a type of racism that we can look at. But in general, like when people say racism, they're mainly talking about prejudice based on race. And white people are a race of people, regardless, like however we look at it. If we're going to say like it's a social construct based on how you look or how we divide you up within society, then being a white person is going to be a race. It's going to be a categorization that we use. And so, therefore, if you are being prejudiced based on race, then treating white people, in a certain way is racist. We can look at whether or not there is some sort of like hierarchy that is going to make it to where white people aren't as affected by this. Yes, of course. Like, we can all admit, like, yeah, black people are going to have it much harder when it comes to racist actions, and it's going to affect society in a much different way than it does for white people. But on an individual level, most people don't care about whether or not the other person has power over them. And even if they did, not all black people are, like, on an individual level, are would have less power than each and every white person. And so, again, on individual levels, like, this is going to make a big difference in some people's lives. I grew up the only white person in my neighborhood, and to me, like, I was the one who was different. Every business we went to, every church we went to, every school we went to, me and my brothers and sisters, we were the only white people around. And to us, like, black people were the ones who held power everywhere we went. And that's just the way it was. So to me, and especially the way that I've grown up, being white and having racist things towards you can still affect you. Maybe not the same on a systemic level, but it is still something that's racist, and it's still something that's bad and immoral, and it's something that matters.
Okay. Yeah. So I think for the most part, I'm gonna agree with you on how all of those experiences play out and how people feel about those experiences, and even that they're individually can be very harmful, and even would be harmful, like, or rather can produce like harmful waves and patterns in society. I guess I think my biggest issue is I think that the word racism, applying it in this way, it seems to me to make it more difficult to address the reality of how this thing came to be. So you talked about the prejudice plus power thing. I don't think it's just that. I think that it's prejudice with the context of hundreds of years of compounding variables that have produced an environment where now if I say the N-word to someone who's black, it's very different than them calling me a cracker, for example. And even on the individual level, just because of that history and the subjugation and the dehumanization that's packaged into that, I think that when we're talking about racism, we're talking about the systems that produced or that directly produced an environment where that imbalance between those two kind of quote unquote slurs creates the contrast between them. And I think that it also, it kind of, you mentioned that like there is for like quote unquote white race. I do kind of take issue with that because I don't think there is a white race in the way that there are other races, because race as it exists is the product of racialization, basically. Like groups have been racialized. And in a lot of ways, whiteness has historically and to this day remains to be almost assumed to be the absence of race. And it's assumed to be the default in a lot of ways. And I think that contrast makes saying things like anti-white racism or these individual, like talking about these individual experiences of white people as racism. I agree they're bad. I agree that we could say prejudiced, bigoted. I just think that we're taking away the root of what we're trying to address when we talk about racism. Is just like, and I think that we're all. I know I'm kind of going all over the place. I'm just trying to get all of my thoughts on this out there at the beginning, and we can dive deep into all of it. I think that when we say that like someone's just being prejudiced based on someone's race, we're presupposing that there is this white race. But I don't think that like a white race has been produced in the way that other races. I think I kind of touched on that. So yeah, that's my general the way I'm coming at this. I think that it muddies the waters.
Okay, so when you say a white race hasn't been produced, what do you mean by that?
So when we talk about the process of like creating a race of people, America is kind of the best example. We kind of perfected racializing people, and that racializing was always built in contrast to white people. And it was built on exclusion based on who would have access to certain resources or certain, land is also a resource, so I guess certain resources and certain opportunities. It was always used to deny people access to things in a way that I don't think has been I would even say that like the word like systemic racism is kind of redundant, but that's besides the point, I guess. I think we could say there's like a white race in common parlance, but like I don't think that it means the same thing when we're talking about white people as a quote unquote race of people as when we're talking about these other racialized groups and how they were racialized and the historical context of that.
So when you say white race, to me it sounds like you're also saying white culture, which I will agree with you on white culture, but not white race. If we're going to say that this is a social construct based on how we categorize you, based on how you look, then yes, we can categorize white people. In throughout history, we can look and see that like different people weren't white, and over time we changed the way that we categorized race, and eventually it came down to it's just how you look. It's based on how you look in the way that we can categorize you based on how you look. And that is like, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. I would say that just the kind of reducing it down to just how you look, I think this might be maybe where the problem is, because I think that it's almost like it's just past the kind of liberal colorblindness solution to like looking at race, and in that like it doesn't really, like when we talk about other groups being considered white at a certain point in time, what we're really talking about is how these groups were barred from access to specific things that white people had access to, right? Like racism is, I think of racism as like a process of dehumanizing certain groups of people in order to bar them from specific resources or opportunities.
So if I go and call somebody the N-word, I'm not being racist then because I'm not barring them from anything?
Well, I would say that the reason that the reason that we would consider that racist is because someone doing that in like modern society is going to contribute to an environment that does make it more likely. You're contributing to a world. You're reinforcing cultural structures in sense that are based in real structures that actually do bar people. You might be like when someone calls, when Fox News goes on and talks about a black person who was killed by the police as a thug, they're reasserting that. Well, I guess that's more systemic, so maybe it doesn't really address your question. But I think it's the reassertion.
Well, no,
Of
the
of that
individual,
context.
yeah, the individual acts make a difference because it
Mhm.
contributes to a systemic problem. And it's not any different for white people if all of a sudden like things are normalized and made to where like white people could be um hated on, or like slurs could be thrown at them, or um like their hatred was allowed, like Mio's worldview was actually
Mhm.
a real thing and that was allowed to like take place. Like, yeah, that would be a problem if what he believes exists right now. If that actually existed, that would be a real problem, right?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that again, I think the biggest problem is that when we say that this is just another form of racism, what we're doing is we're almost we're being very reductive with the concept of racism. It feels like a very surface level way of looking at it. So like when you, even in those interpersonal contexts, when you call someone the N word, you are packaging in with that a history of again of dehumanization and subjugation and borrowing from resources, borrowing from housing, borrowing from having wealth that was accrued being physically destroyed, having so something that's so fundamentally horrifying and American. Unfortunately, even the way that someone feels, or the way that someone might feel. I can't speak for every black person, but my understanding, like the way that someone will feel because of that historical context is going to be very different than someone just being painted a certain way or insulted in a certain way based on, again, like the color of their skin, because there is so much more packaged into anti-black racism, you know?
Right, but when we look at like if you were going to decide whether or not a person is black, are you not deciding this based on how they look?
Sure, you are, but you also might acknowledge. Well, I mean, I guess not necessarily, because like we talk about how like someone like Logic is black. He's half black, but I mean like he's still black. Someone grows up. There are people who are going to grow up in an environment who they like people around them might consider them black, even if they don't look that way. Like there is a cultural aspect to it. But I think historically, when we talk about the way that races, because one of the big like things about from critical race theory is that race isn't just a social construct, but it's also a legal construct. And again, that legal construct is the act of barring specific people from these access to these things. And I think that when we equate the two, when we say that anti-white racism is a thing and that it's just as bad as anti-black racism, or maybe you don't say it's just as bad, but I think the word racism is there as being used there as the problem,
I don't
because I don't think that they're just not comparable.
I agree that race was used to bar people from having access to certain things, but I don't think race was like I think race would have existed one way or the other. Like as humans, we categorize things. We say like we look for patterns. We say, okay, like these people look like this in this way, so we can kind of categorize them. And especially in America, where lots of people have lost like their culture and the like the there aren't like hard lines drawn between one race and another when it comes to their cultures. And so the best way to categorize these people would be just based on the way that they look. Now, true, if we look at somebody like I can't remember her name, but like the girl who married like the prince in London,
Yeah,
I
yeah, I know what you're
like
talking about.
she has black parents, right? She kind of looks
Mhm.
white, but once you find out she has black parents, now we think, okay, well she's categorized as black because her parents are black, even though she just looks like a white chick. Um,
Mhm.
So like in that way, yes, like we would still like look for other things outside of just the way that you look. We'll look at like the way that your family looks as well. But in the end, like we care about categorizing people based on the way that they look for the most part, and then this is like has utility as far as like descriptors, same as like being male, female, man, woman, the clothes that you're wearing, how tall you are, like all of these things are things that we can see with our eyes and therefore are helpful, and we can categorize people in that way. Do you disagree with any of that?
I don't think so. I think that the initial thing you said about how like race would be used even if it hadn't had all of these other things packaged with it. I that might be true. That we might have. I mean, there obviously there are like phenotypical loose collections of phenotypical traits that we associate with a specific race, but that that wasn't it, you know, in reality, that's not how this thing played out. It wasn't just that certain people looked a certain way. It was that certain people looked a certain way, and because of that, we're going to block them from being human, literally in like written into the word of the law that people who looked this way were not we're not given rights in the same way that people who didn't look that way were.
Sure, but so that's not necessarily true. So like there was like an idea of what a black person was before we actually like uh had like mixed societies with them, to where like we were disbarring them, right? Like there were
Sure.
scientists talking about traveling to Africa and the Africans there and the black people there and how they weren't really human and blah blah blah. Them not being human was based on the fact that they were black, but they were
Mhm.
black based on the categorization. And so the categorization was going to be there either way. Now, yes, at times we use this to like make it to where other people weren't included. So like Irish people, Italians, like we could make it to where like we held this thing that we called white and we didn't like them enough to where we wanted to, keep that from them. But like this has evolved to be something to where it's not it's way simpler than that, and it's much more it's more easily utilized within society because we can just look at somebody and decide where they fall. And so, if that's the case, then right now, race isn't being used in a way to uh, include or exclude people, um, but it's being used as a way to categorize people. And it is the most obvious categorization that we have. It's what race, whether or not somebody's white or black, is more obvious than whether or not they're male or female. It's more obvious than whether or not they're a man or a woman, whether or not they have blonde or blue hair, whether or not they have, green or brown eyes. Like their race is going to be the first thing that we see normally because it is the most obvious. We could have categorized this differently, possibly, but I don't think the categorizations would have been as obvious as we have them now.
Well, I don't know if it's really as I agree that like if there's like a very dark skinned black person, the contrast between like a very dark skinned black person and like the average like white person, like you can obviously like at a glance like you can make this determination, but the gradient there is so drastic that there are so many cases that simply don't fit in based on just that
That's
glance.
true,
And
but like most people are like we don't draw hard lines on these things, but for the most part, we will all look at somebody and we will all agree what categorization they fall into. Um, but like there,
Sure, I don't disagree with that, but I think that again, like when we talk about race specifically, like you're talking about like like skin color, you know, like we could say like someone has like
Not
dark,
just
like, oh,
skin color. I mean, it's like,
sure.
their nose shape, their eyes shape, their,
But,
facial
but,
hair,
but
like things like that.
But does that start to, the more that we dig into that, it starts to become like less useful at a glance, right?
Well, over time it probably will, but right now, no, I don't think so.
Well, like if we say like, I guess like if there's like two, if I mean hypothetically, there's two people in a lineup, and like someone's saying like, oh, well, I was attacked by the white guy, and there's two people, and they like one of them is white and one of them like is black, like is very dark skinned, and one's very light skinned. Like it's going to be very obvious which one they're talking about. But I think that this isn't really race that we're talking about. I think that we're reducing race down. I agree that this is how people use it in the common parlance. I think that's kind of part of the problem, is that people are assuming this thing as like a default and useful way to categorize people. But in like the way that like critical race theorists look at this thing is how has it been used to categorize people, and what did it mean to categorize people these ways? And
Right.
historically, it's meant violence and subjugation and refusing housing and things like that, or even just implicit segregation by refusing specific housing.
Yeah, sure. And that's fine. That is a lens to look at race through. Critical race theory is just a different lens to look at it, but that is not the lens to look at it through. That is not the way to look at race. Race is a social construct, and we look at it through the social construct, which is based on how somebody looks. So it's not that it's like a dumbed down version of race compared to critical race theory. These are two completely different things. That one is the way that we utilize it in our everyday life, and the other one is the way that we can study it and look at it and try to find solutions for the problems that come with it.
I guess I kind of agree that I think that it plays into like critical race theory kind of would talk about the way that those things are used as shortcuts. I don't know that they're like mutually exclusive ways to perceive it, but I think I think that like we currently live in a country where most schools don't have very developed curriculum about the history of racism in this country, and we still have a lot of residual and sometimes less or sometimes more explicit like racism that has produced certain like environments where like when we argue with like these groypers and stuff, they're telling these very just so stories about black people being a certain way, and I think that if we want more understanding about those things, then we have to talk about race as it was written, as it was created, as it was used, and the way that that historic use still impacts people today and is still part of how we think about it today, sometimes in ways that we don't even like fully recognize.
Yeah, but this is like I talked about earlier. Like there are a bunch of different ways that we can look at race or look at racism. And like each one is valid in its own way. But with like colloquially, we don't actually look at it that way. Like most people within society aren't looking for CRT to tell them what is or isn't racist.
I agree, but I think they should. That's actually my prescription. I think that more
I
people
don't.
should be taught about this way. I know you don't. That's okay. We can talk about that. But that's kind of the thrust of this, is that I don't think that we can really understand how race is used even as a surface level, like just based on how someone looks. I don't think that we can really understand that without taking this critical look at how that thing evolved and how like certain people were categorized and like legally categorized and legally restricted from certain things. And I think that is, and again, it kind of comes back to this like whiteness historically being this like the default, this perceived absence of race, that other groups were raced groups. And I think that when we just say that there's a white race and there's black race, like, and these things are just like looking at a glance, I understand that people use it this way, but I would say that when we're using it this way, we're robbing people from the opportunity to like get a deeper understanding of these things. And I think that you understand these things at a deeper level than most people. And I think that not to like be too prescriptive or to be like reading mind reading or anything, but I think like some of the knowledge that you have, the deep knowledge that you have about these things, maybe you might be like taking it for granted that like other people see some of those things in that way.
I don't take it for granted. I'm saying that these are completely different things. Like, again, like using systemic racism as a way to like prescribe how to fix some things that are unjust with the way that we categorize race. Like, yes, this is a good way to look at it. Using CRT as a way to look at it and see like what laws are unjust, or like what things within society and the way that we interact are unjust. Using whiteness to look at these things and decide what is or isn't unjust. Like, I think that these are all different ways to look at it, but I think that if we implement these things, instead of just saying like it's based on how you look, but instead like we use this tool that says this is how it is and that's just that, this is like a new way of essentializing race that like I don't think that that's like, yes, color blindness is not something that we want right now, and it's something that like could be harmful, but that should still be the goal. Like, that should still be what it is that we're aiming for, not essentializing race more, but like right now we just look at somebody, we say, hey, based on the way that you look, this is how we categorize you, and through that they still can be oppressed and excluded in a lot of different ways. But like, we can just look at that and know that people are going to be excluded in different ways. We don't have to go find CRT to know that people are going to be excluded. We can find different ways that they will be excluded. And in lots of ways, CRT is going to be completely wrong. And in lots of ways, CRT is going to be completely right. It's just a different tool. We can't use CRT to view race completely. This is not like the new way to view race.
I think it's a new way. I think it's the most like I think so. The way that I think of critical race theory is people are looking at history, the history of race and its impact. And I think that we again we just really can't talk about how race is used colloquially without acknowledging how race got to that point.
That's true,
Right?
but again, we're like, we can use all of these things as different tools. That's all fine. Like, I'm not saying get rid of any of them. I appreciate all of them, and I understand all of them, and I use all of them, but I use all of them in different ways. Whereas like, if we're talking about being racist to a white person, there is no CRT for that, right? There is no like systemic racism for that, but the way that it affects an individual is still going to be the same. You can go tell them like, well, actually,
I don't
CRT says that you're wrong. No, I'm not saying
it's the same.
Hold on.
Because it. Oh yeah, go ahead, finish.
When I say the same, I don't mean the same for a white person as it is for a black person. Obviously, I've already said that. So that's not what I mean when I say the same. I say like, I say like it's the same, as in like that person is going to feel how they're going to feel regardless of what CRT has to say about it.
I agree with that. And but I think that like, what do we gain from using the word racism here? Because I feel like I think you might agree that they're like like racism against a white person, even in that individual context, is very different than racism against a black person in that individual context. And I think that when we use the same word and then we look at the history of how this word came to be, we look at how race was constructed, we look at how it's an exclusionary concept, and how white people weren't really viewed as like a white race until even later in the game. I think that we're losing context when we equate these two.
I think you're losing
even if we
context.
say we're not equating them.
I
Yeah,
think you're
go ahead.
losing context if you're looking at history as though that is what's happening now. That's not what's happening now. That's not the way we view race now. And so the reason it's important is because this is how we view race now. This is like and again, it is the most obvious factor. When you look at somebody, this is the easiest way to categorize them right off the bat is the
Skin
way that we
colors.
huh?
Their skin colors, right?
Skin
Because
color,
I feel like
race in
you're
general.
leaning
I'm
a lot on
talking
race being like really easily identifiable, but I don't know that it really is that clear. I mean, we have a lot of issues with collecting data on race.
again, those are outliers though. For most people, like, yes, we will look at some people and say like this person is hard to categorize, but for most people, yes, we will look at them and say this person looks like a black person, this person looks like a brown person, this person looks like a white person, like this person looks Native American or Asian. Like, we can make those decisions pretty simply. That is the most obvious way to categorize somebody right off the bat. Now, it can get more nuanced and more difficult in some ways, and that's true. But in general, for the most part, this is going to be the most obvious and easiest way to categorize people uh, right off the rip just by looking at them. And if it is acceptable to be racist towards white people, then the way that we categorize people, like this one way to because I feel like you talk about all of these other things. I feel like what you're really saying is that because white people hold some sort of systemic power, that this isn't going to affect them the same as it's going to affect other people.
Not, no, I don't think that's really, and I really think that my biggest contention is really just the word. I think the experiences of people who are that we're talking about, who are like white people who are experiencing like what you would call anti-white racism. I think those like their feelings are valid in a lot of ways, but I don't think that what they're feeling is racism, because I think that when we again when we talk about racism, we're talking about a historic way of barring specific people from access to specific things based on the perception of them being part of a certain
so
race.
you're
Right?
saying white people aren't a race because we didn't view them as a race until recently.
I would say historically, in a lot of ways, whiteness, like I've said this a few times, but whiteness is kind of viewed as like the absence of race. Like people aren't,
But that's
because
whiteness is
the reason I
about
say that,
culture. It's not about race.
well,
Whiteness is culture. Whiteness is the way that we exclude people
yeah,
based on social norms.
yeah, well, yeah, but but not just social norms, but also this was like written into the letter of the law, right? Like the Dred Scott ruling was, I mean, this is, I guess, is a ruling, a Supreme Court ruling, but it was like that no black person would have, or no African man was entitled to the rights that a white man was. Like we're talking about things that were written into the law. This is what race was, and still the how it came to be what it is today is based on it being constructed in this way to justify the atrocities that were committed up to people.
Yes, but again, that's when you say whiteness, like
Mm-hmm.
the idea, the concept of whiteness is talking about white culture. It's not talking about just
Yeah.
race. It's talking about culture. Race is different from culture. Race is the way that we categorize people based on the way that they look, whereas culture is like all of the other things that come with that grouping that we would say like these are common things that take place within your group of people.
Yeah, I don't think I disagree with that.
So then why do we keep talking about culture? I'm not like we should be talking about
Well, I
race.
think that I guess race doesn't exist without a culture that racializes people.
I completely disagree with that.
But I think I understand. I think I understand what you're saying, and that you're talking about like so maybe I think that you're using race to just talking about like visual cues that we have that say that a person is part of a certain group, right?
Yes, the way that we categorize them, yes.
But what are those, like how did those groups come to be?
Well, again,
Why are they viewed as a different group?
as
It's not just because they
humans.
look a certain way,
Well,
right?
no, it kind of is. So, like, as humans, again, we look for patterns and then we categorize things. Like, that's just something that we do. And like, it's something that is so inherent to us, is looking for patterns and trying to come to some sort of prescription or some sort of description from those patterns. Like, it's something that just we do in insane amounts, to where, like, now we're kind of realizing that we do this, and we're trying to deconstruct those things and figure out, like, how it is we came to these conclusions and how it is that we ended up where we are. But that doesn't change the fact that, like, we will still look at a bunch of people and see the way that they look and then categorize them in different ways based on the way that they look. And that is what we call race.
Sure, but if we just say that that's what race is now, I don't think that I think that's maybe the biggest disagreement. I don't think that like we can just say that this is these visual cues and this like pattern recognition is what race is now, or even like even to most people, even if they think that, I don't think that their understanding of race can be really can like the internalization of race can really be expressed just based on that, because I don't think we can help but package in, or rather, I guess we can avoid it. But I think that if we ever want to address like any of these things, we have to talk about how it came to be that these people are viewed as distinct races of people, not just people who look differently, but races of people, which has a very subspecies context to it.
Yeah,
and it does, because that's how it was constructed, and that's what it was used for, to deem certain people as a subspecies of humans.
That's true, but again, you're talking about something different. Like, when you're talking about ways that we view this, yes, there are lots of ways that we can view this through different lenses to come to different prescriptions or figure out different problems within race. But, like, colloquially, that's not how we look at race. That's not how we decide whether or not someone is one race or the other. And so,
I agree with that.
the like, on an individual basis, when somebody is going to discriminate on you just because of the color of your skin, this seems like the most obvious part of you. This is the thing that, like, is most identifiable to somebody, and you are being discriminated based on that, to where, like, no matter where you go, this is what people see of you. This is what they see first. This is the first way that they will categorize you, before gender or sex or anything. They will categorize you based on your race, and being discriminated based on that makes it seem as though there is something wrong with you inherently, almost, because this is the way that most people view you.
Sure. And I agree with that. And it, just to reassert this, like I really do think that like the people who are in the situation where they've been targeted in that way, and they especially if they what I would say is that like so an example that that we can see in real time that happens all the time is like, say like a black person posts something on social media, and then let's say they posted something and they got too close to Mio and his Groiper hive nest, and now they've been getting spammed with like crime stats, and they've been getting spammed with blah 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 blah, and they tweet something like, "Oh, fucking white people." And then everyone's like, not all white people, like, and like, wow, this is racism against white people. But like, well, these are very, very like what led to that happening is so drastically different than what led them, like, or rather what led to that happening is so complex and rooted in so much history that we can't remove from this surface level skin color analysis, right? Like these, like someone saying that if a black person says something like that, well, I think that there we can express more charitability to that than a white person who's just mad that like they who does the spam the crime stats, or who does say that like black people are a certain way, like, because, and it's not just because like, oh well, this black person had this experience with these particular white people. It's that experience in the context of the history that led those people to feel comfortable spamming those crime stats at them in a Twitter thread. Like, we really can't separate those things.
I think you can. I think it's necessary that you separate those things, because you're losing like an entire just regular tribalistic way that people look at these things and say like, I have something in common with this person just because I look like them. And that's not like, nobody's gonna think like, well, I shouldn't, like, this is different from when it happens to a black person because hundreds of years ago it was different, so now it should be different for me today. Like, no, nobody's going to think of it that way. Currently it is a tribalistic thing, and it is the first thing that we see of people, making it a very important marker on somebody and making it seem as though it's almost inherent to you and your being.
Yeah, and I agree that is how most people see it, but I think this is I view that as a problem, and I think that the solution to that is education about how these things came to be.
They can all coexist at the same time. You don't have to just use CRT or any other lens to view race through. You can look at it a bunch of different ways, and they are all valid in different ways. And a tribalistic way is the way that we actually interact with these things on a daily basis. The way that CRT views it is going to add on so much other history and things that nobody cares about.
Well, that's kind of, again, that's kind of the problem, because when you talk about a white person experiencing that, they are just experiencing what you're describing, which is like someone's saying you are white, and so therefore, or you have this certain skin color, and so blah blah, I hate you for that. But when someone does that to a black person, it comes with it, again, all this history of being barred from specific things based on that, being excluded from humanity because of that. And I understand that you're separating two like distinct like theoretical concepts, but I think that like when we look at each of those concepts, we can ask more questions, and we start to see like the way that those patterns emerge isn't just based on, I mean, like we can say it's just based on like people look a certain way, but that was used to construct far more, right?
Sure.
And that
is my
the environment we live in today.
And we talked about this a little bit earlier, so let's go back to this. Because we categorize things based on like, or we look for patterns and categorize things regardless, one way or the other, it seems as though we would have ended up in an area like this. So like we see stories of like when there were Italians who didn't look super Italian and could pretend that they were white and act as though they were white. We can see these stories about Jewish people. We see these stories even about some black people whose parents were, one was a slave and the other one was the master, and they looked white enough to where they could pass and walk around pretending that they were white all the time. The way that we viewed these people, because they were just basing it on the way that they looked in those moments, this is still the way that they categorized race, whether they knew it or not. They didn't want to categorize it that way, but they still did. And they wanted to add in all of these genetic factors or factors based on lineage, but they weren't able to do that in most cases. They had to just look at the person and decide where it was they were supposed to be categorized. So even throughout history, in the way that you're talking about it, they still did it the way that we do it today. They just didn't want to do it that way.
Yes, but in a lot of those contexts, there was a purpose to that categorization that was presupposing something, right?
Right.
Like the purpose of categorizing people as black or white wasn't always just as a quick identifier.
I don't think that changes what I said, though. Okay. And so my point is that right now, the way that we categorize race is one way that we have categorized it and would have categorized it regardless of the of history. We would have gotten to this point one way or the other. It seems as though we started off there, we changed it to ways to exclude people, and then eventually came back around to just categorizing it based on the way that you look again, because that is kind of the natural way of categorizing it.
Well, I think that I can, there's definitely like, I can conceive of a world where we didn't have all this history and we just categorize people on that, like that, just that like loose collection of how they look. And that might be useful. And that would have happened anyway, but since we do live in a world where
it doesn't have to be one or the other, man. It doesn't have to be one or the other.
It is. We currently live in a world where it wasn't created that way, right? It wasn't just that way. Like
right.
it was like that was combined with access to things, with legal like context.
Yes. We need all of these things. Like we need all of the lenses. We need all of the ways to look at it. We need all of the ways to deconstruct it. Like we need all of these things at the same time, but not just one of them. That would be ridiculous. Like we can't just like forget about how people actually interact with race on a daily basis in a very tribalistic manner.
Well, so I think that someone who's part of a group that has been racialized experiences race in a very different way than a white person in their day-to-day life.
Right.
So it's again
in our country.
In reality, it's not the same. I'm specifically talking about American racism. Like
But race is viewed very similarly all across the world right now. And like it is categorized pretty much the same all across the world right now. Like we're not going to go somewhere and they're going to call what we call a white person a black person or something like that, right? We all pretty much view race the same. And in some countries, like the way that CRT makes it sound is though if white people didn't try to exclude black people in the very beginning, race would not exist. And I think that is bullcrap. I think that is really dumb.
I would say that what most of them would say is that if that had happened, then race wouldn't exist in the way that it exists today.
True. But that's still more based on the social construction and in a historical look at it. But it's not like, yes, the way that somebody in an everyday occurrence deals with their own race, or the way that other people interact with your own race, is different from the way that other races do. Just the same as like a black person versus a Latino person, like the way that they're going to interact with other people based on their race is going to be very different from each other. But it's not as though they're all just not white, and therefore they all have the same experience of not being white.
Yeah, that would be reductive, but those interactions still like, I mean, you can say like this is just one lens, but I think that like to really understand those interactions, we have to look at how those groups were like distinct, or were created in rather how they were distinguished from each other, and how they were distinguished from like the superstructure that they existed within.
I'm not understanding. I'm really not. Like, okay. I don't understand why.
I guess
why is it that we have to only look at that and not look at all, like, the ways that I'm talking about and the way that people deal with this, like, on an everyday basis? Why do you just have to have one or the other? I don't understand this.
Well, I don't just want to have one or the other. I think that if we're talking about racism specifically, then when we're talking about something that is packaged with all these other things, and I think that like what do we gain from? I guess rather I think that we're losing something when we reduce the word racism down to just this prejudice based on your skin color. Like, we can talk about prejudice and bigotry based on skin color, but when we talk about racism specifically, I think that we're looking at the way that these races were constructed, the way that people were differentiated, and again, based on this historic access to things. I really think that's like the central, and how those things compounded in the way that even those interpersonal altercations would be very different based on the direction that the insults are flowing.
Because his, do you do you think that if we didn't have the history that we have now, we wouldn't in some ways have this like tribalism in the way that we interact with each other?
Oh, I'm sure we'd have very like different forms of tribalism, yeah, for sure. But yeah, no, I absolutely.
That's kind of my point, is like one way or the other, we would still differentiate ourselves from others and cling to groups that we see some sort of kinship with. And the most obvious one is the way that we look. So, like, if it was going to exist in some manner, no matter what, then saying we have to look at it through CRT, where it acts as though it wouldn't exist at all if it wasn't for these few things in history that happened, I think that that would be a reductive way of looking at it. I think you need all of the ways of looking at it in order to actually understand it.
I kind of reject the idea that the majority or even like a significant amount of like critical race theorists would say that in some alternate reality where racism didn't play out in the way that it did, that we wouldn't have other forms of tribalization that categorize people. I don't think that people are making these claims. I think that they're saying that like because of the way things did play out and because of the way that people were categorized and because of the results of that we still have to deal with today, that we're not teaching about in most schools, that we're not talking about like slavery is like an end note. We view it as something that like America defeated, like fascism and communism, rather than something that was integral to the origins of the country, and something that led through the legacy of Jim Crow and Jane Crow, and the way that I think that we just can't get a picture of these things without looking at the history. I think that it doesn't make sense without looking at that history.
I again, I agree with that. I'm not disagreeing with that.
Okay. So, but like you understand why when I say that like there's a very big difference between a white person being racist against a black person and a black person being racist, as you would say, against a white person. Like these are very different things.
Well, the difference is the way that each one would experience it and the way that it would, the way that this would contribute to some sort of systemic oppression towards that group.
And one of them is like culturally almost like punching down in a way that like saying, hey, I like the N word, it has been used to say as like a power thing, like from white people on black. That's why like it's not okay for like you or me to say the N word right now, right? Like, but it's okay for like people to say cracker, like because they're so drastically different. They just don't have the same weight. So when we just say that like they're both being racist towards each other, we lose that, right? We lose that difference. We're looking at it and we're looking at it in this very surface level of just, okay, well, they look different and that's what they're talking about, but that's not what racism has been. That's not what racism really is.
But this is a problem. Like, if we're like, we don't actually give them any more systemic power by allowing them to say the N-word or by allowing them to say cracker. What we actually do is almost infantilize them and say, well, we're going to have this rule, but we're going to be inconsistent on the way that we hold people accountable to this rule. And I think that that's a huge problem. I think that like, especially in like understanding that history changes over time and that demographics change over time, like if all of the sudden Mio's world became a thing, they would look back and say, okay, well, we need to deconstruct this. How did we end up here? And then they'll, oh, yeah, that's right. There was this long period of time where everybody infantilized black people and allowed them to think that like they could talk to everybody however they wanted to. And then eventually, once they came into power and held a lot of systemic power, they felt like they were superior to everybody else and were able to talk and treat them however they wanted. I think it's important that we are consistent in the way that we hold people accountable, especially culturally, so that we all treat this is like a way to get to a point where we are all equal. Now, systemically, we can change that. We can say, like, well, some people get some sort of like reparations, or some people get some sort of like affirmative action. Like, systemically, we don't necessarily have to apply everything consistently, but culturally, we definitely need to apply these things consistently in order to ever have a dream of some sort of equality.
Um, I don't know about the. So I guess like um, when you talk about like the way that. Sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought, but I wanted to respond to like something you said in the first half of that, where you were can you restate what you were talking about more of the interpersonal stuff, I think, and like I'm so sorry.
I was saying that culturally we want to hold people accountable consistently,
Well,
whether it's the N word
right.
or the cracker or something like that. We don't want to infantilize them.
Right, and I don't think that I don't think that it's we're doing. I mean, I think there are ways to engage in that are infantilizing, and I'm not even saying that I'm like innocent of this. I probably have, like, I'm sure that there are things I've said even in this conversation that like would be like problematic if someone like was really like, being hypercritical of me. But I don't think that it's about infantilizing people as much as acknowledging the difference in degree of like pain that might be packaged into those interpersonal interactions. Because when you call a white person a cracker, yes, you're insulting them based on their like white skin. Yes, you're saying that you might even be essentializing that white skin in some way. But what you're not doing is saying, hey, I am better than you because of the like my skin color has made me better, and like my like you're not packaging in this my ancestors owned your ancestors, which is packaged in when you like a white person calls the black person the N-word, right?
That's true.
Like
We're that's not, it's not always going to be that way though. Like, we
I mean,
set up
hopefully,
the
yeah.
structures right now that eventually lead to something else. And if we are saying like, hey, you are like Mio and them, like, they're at least right about one thing: white people will not be the super majority forever, right? Like,
Mhm.
that's going to be gone
Yeah,
in our lifetime, and we will probably even be a true minority in our lifetimes, right? Like,
yeah,
the
maybe.
we are setting up cultural norms right now that can lead to more problems down the road. And so saying this group of people culturally are allowed, or like um socially are allowed to do certain things that other cultures are not allowed to do, that like, can you not see how that's obviously going to lead to other problems?
I see how that could be viewed as like a slippery slope thing, but I think that like I don't know if that's like that's not really how I would. I mean, okay, I wouldn't think about like something like the N-word in that context necessarily. Like that, I think that is a conversation to have. But I'm talking about like the weight of it being used right now, right? I'm talking about the difference between the weight of those slurs being used in like right now today as they're used, and like the reason I'm not saying that we should like create laws that like say white people shouldn't be allowed to say the N-word. I don't care about that like legally, but I think that we need to acknowledge the drastic difference between using that word to someone when it's packaged in with this history of dehumanization and subjugation that is not packaged in with the quote unquote reverse racism. And I think that when we talk about racism, we're talking about that history packaged into it. I really do. I think that's the way we need to acknowledge that, or else we're not going to be able to move past, because we do exist in a world that suffers from this history, right?
Yeah, so we can look at this and say, hey, either we allow everyone, white or black, to say the N word, which would obviously have some pretty drastic systemic problems, or we can say just black people are able to say the N word, which obviously will lead to some systemic problems. Or you can say, hey, nobody should say this word because it was a demonstrable word that was used to oppress people over time, and that we don't want to infantilize one group or give advantages to one race over another, because over time this can lead to other problems. As we've seen throughout history, these things do lead to other problems, and so we can learn from our mistakes in the past and fix that now so that we don't have those problems in the future. Like, one of these doesn't have like the bad outcome, the other two do.
Yeah. So
this is why Destiny, he goes off about how he should like be able to say the N-word. Yes, he doesn't say that he should be able to say the N-word because he so badly wants to be able to say the N-word. It's because he wants people to see like the hypocrisy in the way that we hold people accountable for these sorts of things, and come to the realization that really nobody should be able to say it.
But I guess I don't agree with the framing. Like, so obviously there are like cultural structures that quote unquote bar someone from using that word. But when we say that like a white person's not allowed to say the N-word, what we're saying is that like what we're really saying is, hey, if you say this, what we're acknowledging is that if you say this, you are packed. It has all of this weight behind it, and you are going to hurt people. So, like you're gonna hurt not just black people. Like you'll like, it is hurtful for people to like be like for that language to be used against them in that way. However, if a black person like uses that word among themselves or someone else, that pain is not being steered in the same direction. It's not being used to cause harm in that way, right? Like
sure, I'm not
in
some ways,
about,
but okay, so I'm Native American, right? I identify as white because I look white. So if somebody calls me a cracker, like, yeah, like that hurts, like in a way as though I am responsible for the sins of my fathers, like as though I should somehow like feel bad and have some sort of almost like I should feel as though I owe you something because other people did something wrong, right? So again, like when we go back to like the individual basis and the way that these things are used, like, yeah, they're very similar on an individual basis. They're very similar. They don't have like the historical or sorry, they both have like this historical way of making one group either bigger or smaller than the other group.
Yes. So if you just look at that angle of it, yes, but then you expand it a little bit and you see that like, well, even in that interaction, it is like a black person knows like the history, and not every single black person.
But that doesn't change anything. That like you are correct, but that doesn't change whether or not they should or shouldn't be able to say the N-word. This almost puts it in like a very what do you call it? Like I can't think of the word. Like it kind of puts that problem into a default, whereas the individual basis does have a prescription that comes with it. Whereas other things like systemic or culturally or within social norms, like those don't have the prescription that come with it. They just say like, there's no reason to say why black people shouldn't be able to say the N-word. Whereas on the individual basis, this does have a prescription that comes with it. And people ignore the individual basis, especially leftists, because they like to look at things through systemic problems or through hierarchies and, all of these other ways of viewing things. But they forget about the individual bases. They forget about how these things actually affect people. And individual bases lead to systemic problems.
So I agree. This is why at the beginning I wanted to separate, or I wanted to make it clear that like I'm not saying that like there's not like real harm in what you're calling anti-white racism. My issue is
you want a different standard for different races.
Well, I don't believe that race is a thing outside. I don't agree with the. I think it's reductive to look at. It's again, it's almost like a colorblind, like a kind of slightly better form of colorblindness to look at race as just someone, like the way that someone's categorized. It's how someone's categorized in a racialized society.
But you said that
again,
you
my
don't
main
deny that we would end up likely categorizing things in the same way if we didn't have the history that we currently have.
That might be the case, but I think that's besides the point, because we don't exist in that world. We have this history, and when we talk about the interpersonal stuff, I'm not even talking about I'm not talking about systems necessarily. I'm talking about how I guess I'm talking about how those systems intersect with that interpersonal interaction. So because we're like, I mean, I understand what you're saying about how the white person might feel, oh, I'm responsible for, like, if you're being quote unquote racist towards a white person, you might be saying, oh, you're responsible for the sins of your fathers. But if we just say, if we use the same word to describe, hey, you're guilty for the sins of your fathers, and hey, you and your fathers are subhuman or not human, like we're losing what is being articulated with this, right?
I yes, in some ways, but again, on an interpersonal level, I don't think that that's like the way that most people internalize these words. Like even black people will look at the ways that they are oppressed today and see the N-word as a way to reinforce the ways that they're oppressed today, not as a way to reinforce that their ancestors were once slaves, right? Like they're looking at this as a way to reinforce oppression that they currently feel today.
Can you restate that? I think I kind of lost you in that one.
Yeah, I'm saying that if a white person calls a black person the N-word, they're not, like, the way that they internalize this is not as a way to reinforce what their ancestors once were, which is slaves. They're looking at this as a way to reinforce the racism that they currently feel today, like the oppressions that they feel today.
Yeah, but I think that part of those oppressions that they feel today is I think a part of it is the historic aspect of it. Like I think that there are going to be like black people who just like feel like they're just being insulted based on their skin color, but when you do know the history, it must feel very different. That's kind of my, and we're still trying to undo these things. We're still trying to deal with the fallout of these things, and I think that if we just use this word that has, and a lot of people say that like we're redefining racism as prejudice plus power. I don't really think, I think that's a reductive definition in and of itself, but I don't think this is like a new thing. I think historically we've talked, like if you look at like old Oxford definitions of racism, it talks about people being grouped in a certain way and then having power asserted over them. I think that what you're talking about exists. I just don't think that I think that we are doing a disservice to the analysis of racism when we call that racism as well. We could use the same word, like technically it's okay, and I think people largely understand what you're saying, but this is why I say it muddies the waters, because I think that it like, if some people are talking about just the skin color and some people are actually talking about the history and how we got to the point where that skin color is used and weaponized in a certain way, we're losing that analysis that's already lacking in so many areas. It's the reason that this anti-CRT stuff is so effective. The reason that people are freaking out whenever we want to have these hard conversations about race is because of the way that people were demonized for talking about these things, right?
So you remember when you and me talked to Mio and Sean last, and we kept saying, like, hey, like, we don't even like deny that like black people could have lower IQs on average. To us, that wouldn't change anything. That like you guys are the ones who are ignoring the systemic racism part, and that's the part that we want to focus on, is that there is still systemic racism that would apply more so than some low IQ thing, and that the low IQ thing can still exist, but that wouldn't change our prescriptions in any way. I feel as though
I
that's
don't.
what's happening here, where I'm trying to focus on like the individual aspect of this and close in on it. And each time you're like, yes, but these other things. And I'm like, yes, I'm not denying those other things. Those other things can still exist. I'm just saying that in this one interpersonal, individualistic way of looking at it, those other things don't come into play as much as you think. They can intersect with it, and they can all still exist, and we can view race through those lenses all at the same time. But they it doesn't change the way that somebody internalizes these things on an individualistic basis. And if we change expectations for one race versus the other, this leads to other problems because of tribalism, because we view race or because we see race as the very first thing when we look at somebody. This is something that most people feel will identify or is a huge part of their identity. And when they are discriminated based on something that is the most obvious identifier of them, it seems as though their entire identity is invalidated regardless of what happened throughout history.
I agree that that pain is very real. I just don't think that we're accurately describing it when we say that it's racism.
Okay, so let's do this then. Why
Yeah.
wouldn't we use the word specifically racism? Why, like, without going back to everything that we've already gone over, what
Yeah. Well, I guess I
specifically
mean.
the word racism, what does that
Yeah.
change to you? Like, what is the utility of not using racism as the word?
So the reason that I have a problem with the word racism being used there is because we currently live in a society where it's very difficult to have conversations about racism as it existed and how it manifested. This is already a problem, right? So we currently live in this society where this thing is an issue. And so when we look back at the history of racism, we're looking at things that were legal structures and social structures that weaved and interacted with each other in ways that produced people that reasserted a distinctive quality between certain groups of people. And in groups that, like we say, that groups are racialized, again, not that they're just are these specific races. Like, we're talking about things that were racialized. So when we're looking at racism, we're looking at these systems and how they created this racialized society. So I think that at least I feel like that's the best view of it to move past that. We have to acknowledge that exists so that we can move past that. And if we just look at the angle of, hey, well, the white person is being racist against the black person, and I think you agreed to this, that like, even if we say like a white person is being racist against a black person and a black person being racist against a white person, then we're even in these two situations, we're talking about very different things because of those histories.
Okay, so let's say we get to a society where we have fixed systemic racism. It's done. We fixed it. Okay. The history still exists, but like, we can't change history, but we have fixed the systemic problems that came with racism. Okay. We can assume that people will still, in some ways, categorize people based on some sort of immutable characteristics and be tribalistic based on those categorizations. And if they discriminate on each other based on those characteristics, why would we not call that racism?
Well, if we're talking, see what you're kind of asking me is why wouldn't we use the word racism in a post-racial society? Because when we're looking at race, we're looking at something that's constructed that has this history. Even if we can imagine a world where it doesn't have this history, it does. And
well, it's not that we can imagine a world. It's that the hope is to eventually get to that world. And by choosing not to work towards that world, like I agree in some ways, like when it comes to systemic racism, like we can't just be colorblind, right? Like right now, that's not possible. We can't fix systemic racism if we are all colorblind right now. But in some ways, we do need to be colorblind. In some ways, especially socially, the way that we hold people accountable socially, we should be colorblind in those ways because that is the society that we want to work towards. And so separating these things now, where your world becomes a social norm, where like we are not calling things that are discriminating on white people based on their race or based on their skin color, I guess. Racism, this is not leading towards a world, and it doesn't seem to have any value either, but it's not leading towards a world where we get to that colorblind society. It seems to go backwards from that.
Well, I think that I kind of feel the exact opposite in that using this word makes it harder to get to that world. Because right now we have this historic context, we have this reality, and we have to grapple with it. And it's so difficult in American society to have these hard conversations about race. And it makes it harder when there's a lot of white people who are using the word racism to describe them being insulted for being pale or like liking macaroni and cheese or something, when the when we talk about racism in the other direction and we're talking about reasserting hundreds of years of dehumanization and subjugation. And I feel like maybe we're I think the solution is to have these harder conversations. And we like, oh shit, hang on, my headphones just died. Give me like 2 minutes. I need to go find my other earbud.
Yeah, we're definitely looping. And before we end, I want to try to get off of that loop and get to a point where he has a different answer than the one that he's had for everything that I've brought up so far. Because I feel like I've already addressed all of those things.
Wait.
Crap. It keeps freezing on my side, but it's not you, it's my fault. Okay, there we go. You're muted. There you go. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Hello?
Okay.
Hello?
Yes. Okay, cool. I can hear you now.
Okay.
Yeah. So it feels like we have like the opposite prescription. In that I think that using this word in this way makes it harder to talk about to talk about what I think racism like really is and what it's really based on and what the historic construction of it was. I think it makes it harder to have those conversations if we're muddying the waters by just saying that anything just insulting someone in a way that's based on their skin color or something is racism in the same way.
Do you think that if men are discriminated based on their sex or based on their gender, that we shouldn't call this sexism? Like, do you think that would be reductive to call it sexism, even though women have been more oppressed and have a larger historical or a larger history of oppression based on sex? Do you think that it would be reductive to then call it sexism when we discriminate based on sex to men or to males?
In some ways, yeah, because in a similar way, when we're talking about the history of sexism, we're talking about a group of people who are identified in a certain way that were, again, excluded from access to certain things, like being able to vote, being able to own property. In a lot of these ways, it's creating a group based on exclusion again. So when we look at this history, like we can say like, yeah, well, if a woman says like, oh, fuck men, I hate men, and a guy says, "Oh, I hate women," like these might look very similar, but again, they have very different like a historical context that led them to that position, right?
I guess we're gonna have a fundamental disagreement across the board then. Like, I don't think that just because
Yeah, I
something's
don't feel as
different.
strongly about the sexism one. I think that one's I'd have to think about that one more. But I think that there's something to that.
I mean, well, you would have to say that what you just said in order to be consistent on these things, and I like that's my issue is that like you're saying because
Well, hang on,
one's
hang on.
yeah
Okay. I don't think that would be inconsistent because when I'm talking about racism, I'm talking about a very specific process of dehumanization and exclusion that is based on the what we're talking about now, which is like just how you look, right?
well, kind of. We use these words racism, sexism, ageism. Like we use these as like ways to label discrimination based on those things, based on age, based on sex, based on race. And so you're saying that just because one group has had like a lower amount of historical oppression, we shouldn't use this label for them. And because we use these words differently in the past, we shouldn't use it the way that we currently understand them today. Like, I think that yes, you would have, in order to be consistent, you would have to say like, well, the ones who have a much less oppression and a much different history based on these things, we would have to use these labels differently for them.
Well, I think maybe the difference is that I'm not saying that like just because whichever one has had more oppression. I'm talking about like a literal legal concept that like took these physical characteristics and then distributed resources based on that.
Okay, so then at what point do we use those labels uh, in a way that would apply to everybody?
What do you mean, like for racism?
Yeah, for racism, sure.
Um, it doesn't. I don't think like in America it makes very much sense to talk about. We can talk about prejudice. We can talk about discrimination against people based on being perceived white. We can talk about people being hurt and harmed and insulted based on their skin color and stuff. But I don't think that white people are a racialized group in the way that other races are. And part of this is that like race fundamentally isn't a real thing, right? Like yes, we use it as a shortcut to categorize people, but this has a lot of shortcomings as we've acknowledged, and it's not just like a few edge cases. Like there are drastic, like, huge gradients that just simply don't fit into this way of categorizing people. And but even with that being the case, things like just having quote unquote black DNA or black blood has like makes people perceived to be no longer white. Like Obama is not a white president; he was a black president, right? Like we don't view him as a white president, and it's like, yeah.
But that, yeah, again, that's because the way that we view race has evolved over time, and it will probably evolve again to where like it completely changes, especially considering the fact that like we're going to be more and more intermixed. Like, yeah, it's going to keep changing. And the way that we currently view race, there are some people who were discriminated against that we now consider white. And to say like, well, white people haven't experienced race in the same way that other people experienced it. It's like, well, I'm white, but I'm also like Native American. Like historically, yeah, like I've had people who like my lineage was oppressed based on who they were, just as Italians um, or Irish people were oppressed but based on their lineage, but also like they are now considered white. I am white. Like to say that like just because now we consider you white, it's not racism when historically the people who were considered white, we acted differently towards them. Like we view race differently now, so we can't apply the same labels based on history to what it is that we to the way that we look at race now.
Well, I think that you're touching on something interesting there, where we talk about like the difference between like races, quote unquote racism towards like Italian people or towards German people, like these like ethnic bigotries that were also used to like exclude people. I guess not, maybe not, but like Irish people. These were used to like exclude people from whiteness.
Even Jewish people too.
Yeah, Jewish people as well. But when we talk about right now being like racist towards white people, we're literally just talking about people's like, well, I mean, I guess you could say they were packaging in the oh, you're responsible, but I don't think that that's like saying it comes down to that difference between like saying you're responsible for the horrible things that your ancestors did to mine, and saying, well, my ancestors should have done that to you because you're this kind of person, right? Like this distinction is so drastic that I feel like we lose so much by using the same word to describe these two interactions. That's my biggest problem.
Okay. Yeah. We're just going to disagree then. Like, I think that we can have the history and we can understand all of those things at the same time without losing like what it means to be racist to somebody. You know that I appreciate all of those things and I understand all of those things, and I have no issue with them. K Fellows wants to know from RadicalCoder, if you plan to engage with politically provoked Nazis now that so many left-leaning streamers are saying they won't engage with them anymore. Before you answer, just to make this easier on you, I'm going on politically provoked in a couple hours, so
Yeah, well, I have a debate on Friday, debating flamenco on Politically Provoked. I am going to keep. I'm not like an established streamer or anything. I'm not like part of like any communities that are holding me like to some fire or anything. And even if I was, I mean, the reason that I go on Politically Provoked, even though they are kind of foster this very far right audience, is because I have spent the past few years in a lot of Facebook groups and online and stuff arguing with people who believe a lot of the same things that they do. And I mean, I can take it. I think that I'm good at rhetorically engaging with them. I think that my arguments are better than theirs. I think that I have insight that they don't want brought to the table, and I'm going to bring it to the table. I like educating as much as possible, and even if that means I'm force feeding my perspectives on these things to people who would rather just say that black people are dumb, and that's why crime stats look the way they do, and that's why I'm there. I'm not there to appease any specific community. I'm there to argue for things I believe in. So.
Yeah, same. I can't stop going on because my entire reason for going on in the first place was because I feel as though there are people who go on who argue these things very poorly, and if all of like the people who believe things similarly to me, or like the people who would argue against Nazis all stop going on, then the Nazis get to just destroy a bunch of people who are less capable of arguing against them. And so I feel it's necessary that some people continue to go on and continue to argue against them. And I will continue to be very critical of Politically Provoked and continue to tell them what I think of them and the things that they do and say. But I'm not going to just be like, okay, well, now they get to have their echo chamber to hundreds of people at a time. Like, yeah, I'm not bringing them like some big viewership from my audience. Like I have like, I think I averaged like last month, like 12 people watching at a time. So it's not as though I'm like, bolstering their community by any means.
And I would say on top of that, I am open to criticism with the way that I do engage with them. I mean, I think that I make mistakes and I misstep, and I'm always growing as someone who engages in this stuff. I'm still new to these spaces, or at least like the like more public facing spaces. So I mean, I'm always happy to like hear criticism from people who maybe are more impacted by the issues that I'm arguing for, because really at the end of the day, I have much less of a direct like maybe one of the reasons that I'm like able to navigate these spaces so carelessly, I don't know if I'd say I do it carelessly, but yeah, is because I don't have as much of a direct for example, like I appreciate like someone like Taj. Taj is braver than me for going into politically provoked space when he's going to be called low IQ and he's going to be shit on for being black while he's in that space the entire time. And, they're going to call me gay and stuff. And I'm not even gay and I don't even care. Right. Like none of this stuff bothers me. And doesn't have any weight like being waged against me or being like held over me. I'm not being told, hey, why are you talking over people? This isn't a fucking movie theater, or being called like dumb blackie and stuff like this. Like that's not happening to me. And I think that like we need to make sure that we're pushing back against that kind of stuff, so that we can have more voices from other groups in those spaces.
I don't know. Taj is a smart guy and I think he's capable, but I don't think he does a great job when he goes on there. And I think it like hurts a lot when he looks like he's getting destroyed over and over by these groypers to where like it just emboldens them. I would be happy working with Taj to help him, but I currently right now I don't, especially on panels, I don't see the value in him going on there and talking to a bunch of people. But I agree, like it's going to be harder for somebody like him to go on there than it would be for someone like you or me.
Yeah, I think it's important that like non-white voices are on those platforms, and I want to push back in a way that makes it more likely that more people who don't look like me will go into those spaces. Yeah. That's one of my goals. So yeah.
All right, man. Well, I appreciate the conversation.
Well, good chat. I'm sorry we didn't come to too much. I know we agree on like a lot of the. I know you understand all the issues that I'm talking about.
We disagree on semantics.
Yeah, it literally is a semantic distinction. But I just want to reiterate that when I'm talking about racism, and I think when a lot of people who are like people who are in those fields are talking about, like people who are studying these things and trying to really look at the history and how it manifested and what happened, when they talk about racism, they're talking about these legal structures that also manifested in social structures, and that continue to compound based on this exclusion from access to things. And I really think that that's the thrust of it. The difference and the dehumanization part, all of this packaged in is it makes these things very different, even if from one angle we could say that they're the same, based if we just talk about like the skin color difference stuff. But yeah.
Yeah, for me, the biggest problem is that being called a racist or having something labeled racist is going to be, it's like the worst thing you could call somebody. Like, it's up there with murderer and rapist. And
I agree that it is like that, but again, this is, I think, a scenario where one of the things that we need to push for, I think, is like racism is not this like something that only happens from racists who hate a certain group or who are very feel very strongly about their superiority or something like that. Like racism, it really is something that not all black people, but most black people, for example, are going to experience on a day-to-day basis. They're like, James Lindsay shits on in his PragerU video on critical race theory. He shits on this like example of like a black person and a white person walking to a store at the same time, and he says that, oh well, if you go to the white person first, then you're racist because you chose the white person over them, or if you go to the black person first, you're racist because you thought they were going to steal something or something. But what the critical, like someone who's a critical race theorist might say is, well, the black person in this environment doesn't know whether or not that person made that choice based on their race. And in a lot of times that person is making that choice based on their race. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so like these very like small things that happen all the time, like it is a day-to-day experience of people. And I think that having conversations about it and like trying to de-dogmatize the like you're racist, you're bad, rather than trying to acknowledge the ways that all of us manifest racism in our day-to-day lives and trying to reduce that as much as possible.
Yeah, so I was saying the label racist is like the worst thing that you could put on something or someone. And when and you use that to make sure that we don't build um we don't allow racist things to take place to where it becomes a social norm and then leads to racial biases, which leads to systemic racism, which leads to like a harsh history of racist outcomes. um, the the very first step is to stop the racism from happening, the biases based on race. um, that's the the front lines of the war. And because we know this, because we know that's how these systems get built, and that's how these structures get built, and that's how these biases get built, we have to stop it at the front lines. And so regardless of what the history is, we want to stop it. We can't just worry about history, we also need to worry about the future. So i'm I think that putting that label on it, because it's so socially, I almost said dogmatized, but that's not it. It's uh, it's looked down on. Then like we need to make sure that we use that label correctly to stop all forms of racism from taking place in the future. But all right.
Yeah, yeah. I'd just add that like the the I don't know if the front line is I think that the social stuff is part of the front line, but when we talk about the way that racism is like still manifests, it is still producing these disparate results where people are grow up in certain areas that don't have the resources that other areas do,
Yes, but
because of
that
that historical
happens
context.
because of what started on the front lines. Like
Yeah,
that history
but to
happens
amend that,
because,
we have to look at both parts.
well, no, not we can amend it in one way, but at the same time, we want to make sure that history doesn't repeat itself, and we want to make sure we don't make the same mistakes on the front lines that caused the history to happen. Like it, you can't just do one or the other. You got to do both.
Yeah, that's what. Yeah, no, that's what I was saying. We agree on that for sure.
Okay. All right, man.
All right, man. Thanks
Later,
for having me
dude.
on. I appreciate it.
Yep.
See you later.
See you.